This is Principles of Management, and this section is the global environment. After a blip caused by the recession of 2009 to 11, U.S. imports are back now to their 2008 levels of 18% of gross domestic product and exports at 14%. The difference is largely accommodated through the capital markets. In 1990, both stood at approximately 10% of GDP, based on the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Globalization refers to the extent to which trade and investment, information, exchanges of social and cultural ideas, and political cooperation flows between and among countries. Given its size and the physical distance from most other countries, Canada is our largest trading partner, the U.S. conducts less international trade as a percentage of total GDP than most of the other industrialized nations. But this does not mean we are isolated, and if current longer-term trends continue, the global economy, rather than the domestic one, will be the principal determinant of how we are faring. In dealing with people and organizations that are based overseas, and even more so if your own organization is seeking to conduct business overseas, it is important to have a global mindset. This is the ability of managers to appreciate and influence individuals and organizations from different social, cultural, political, institutional, intellectual, and psychological characteristics. This ability rests on our own ability to back away from the presumption and the assertion that the way we do business here is the right way. It's our way. It works here in the U.S., but that does not necessarily mean it's going to work anywhere else. Ethical assumptions about what is right and wrong are bound by both time and place. The decisions people make in economies of affluence are not necessarily the same as those made in economies of scarcity. In some countries, the rights of the collective are more important than the rights of individuals. In other countries, the opposite is true. And so a global mindset has to be relatively judgment-free. Just about every individual and organization in the U.S. purchases something that has been made or grown outside the U.S., and many U.S. organizations sell their products and services in overseas markets. At some point, a firm should recognize that a significant portion of its sales are made overseas and should view itself as a multinational organization. By consensus, that number is 25%. That is, if 25% or more of an organization's sales come from foreign markets, it is called a multinational firm. One of the most striking differences between the U.S. and other industrialized nations and the developing world is that in most of the developing world, there is not a middle class as we know it here. The purchasing power per person of most of the developing world's population is quite limited, but this population of more than 4 billion people occupies the lowest tier of wage and salary levels. It is referred to as the bottom of the pyramid, and for the longest time it was simply ignored. But ignoring the collective buying power of 4 billion people, even if they have little to spend, may be unwise for two reasons. One, this is a group that is still able to purchase things that are inexpensive but meets their needs, and two, is that the world is developing, and a poor agrarian nation of today may not remain that way for too much longer. One of the things that U.S. firms do, just as Japanese car manufacturers do here, is to base a significant portion of their operations in the markets where the products are going to be sold. There's much sense in doing that. The prices of labor and materials are more closely tied to the local markets than if things were simply shipped in from markets where those factors of production are more expensive. This makes the products more affordable in the markets that they're going to be sold in. There's a hierarchy of involvement in overseas operations. Whether it is because a firm is just entering a new overseas market or because there's only a limited demand for their products, some types of international presence are less intrusive and less expensive than others. Generally, light overseas business calls for an export strategy, where production happens domestically and finished goods are shipped overseas. If volume increases, it could sometimes make sense to have some or all of the international operations based in the country where the sales will take place, and this is termed outsourcing or offshoring. Goods produced overseas in low-cost labor and materials markets can be shipped back to the domestic market as well. Overseas production can happen in one of several ways. The design or product concept can be licensed to an overseas manufacturer, and this can include the technology needed to build the product, along with managerial and process skills, patent and trademark rights. If a complete package of production services is packaged and sold, this is referred to as a franchise. If the domestic firm wishes to retain control over the product and systems, it could set up its own manufacturing plant in the overseas location, which is done by direct investing. If this is done in cooperation with a firm located in the host country, it could take the form of a joint venture, and the host country firms can facilitate many aspects of setting up the new business. If it is not shared, the domestic firm is said to be setting up a wholly owned subsidiary or foreign affiliate. Facilities can usually be purchased, but sometimes they have to be built, and this, the most risky of all the international management systems, is called a greenfield venture. When in a prior session we spoke about the general environment of the firm, we noted that an organization is closely connected to the environment and is dependent on it. This is true of international as well as domestic environments. As for local economies, not only do they have very distinct levels of development, from agrarian to post-industrial, but they each have somewhat related business cycles. The recession that struck the U.S. in 2009 was global in nature, and some countries fared much worse than we did here in the U.S. What marks a developed country from one that is developing is the state of its infrastructure, the physical facilities such as transportation and utilities, as well as government stability and education. Some areas of the world are politically unstable, which adds a degree of risk to an overseas venture. And the CIA keeps an excellent database called the World Factbook, which addresses this. It is freely available online. Social values also vary from region to region. One of the most commonly accepted metrics of social indicators was developed by Gerd Hofstede, who kept a website where countries can be compared. It's available online now. In the system he developed, the critical metrics are these. One is called power distance, the degree to which there is a distance in hierarchical levels of authority, and this relates to the degree to which authority can be questioned. Second is uncertainty avoidance, the degree to which people are uncomfortable with ambiguity. Third is individualism versus collectivism, the degree to which a person is expected to feel responsible for him or herself, as opposed to the degree to which a person is expected to feel responsible for the entire community. Fourth is masculinity versus femininity, which is perhaps a poorly termed metric, but relating to a preference for achievement, assertiveness, and work centrality. Presumably, that is more typical of males than females. It's an old system. And the last is long versus short-term orientation. Irving Janis, who organized the Globe studies, also developed a series of metrics that can be used to compare countries, but these largely reflect and expand upon the metrics developed by Hofstede. In addition to this, it is useful to understand that the premise of communication varies widely from country to country. In some places, the context in which communication occurs greatly affects its meaning. In others, it is more independent of context. In the U.S., communication is only slightly affected by context. In China or Korea, the opposite would be true. One other thing to keep in mind is that the international market is not a static one. Several countries, for example, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, are developing more rapidly than the existing industrialized countries, and the economic gap that used to exist between the two sets of countries is fading. For the remainder of the world, it may be useful to think in terms of regions rather than countries, as regional trade agreements provide a common set of rules for dealing with the European Union, or the ABC countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, South America. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization, now representing about 97% of the world's population, are standardizing the terms on which business is transacted, facilitating international trade. A ripple effect of this was studied by Gelfand and Nishi, who found that to the extent that regional cultural practices were an uncomfortable match with the rules of doing international business, those cultural practices have begun to fade. The discussion of how cultures have different modalities and ethical priorities, have different priorities in authoritarianism, uncertainty avoidance, work centricity, individualism, and place different values on the context of communication. All of these things cause us to step back and consider our own axiology, our own point of view on the topic of managing ethics and social responsibility, which is the subject of the next session. Good evening.